Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
According to the Global Leadership Forecast of 2018, published by DDI, 67% of Gen X leaders said they would like to see more external coaching, and 57% want external development. The research also shows that CEOs are more concerned about developing next-gen leaders than they are about any other issue, including cybersecurity, global recession, and political uncertainty. And only 14% of CEOs say that they have the leadership talent they need to execute their strategy. It's important that companies offer resources to develop good leaders, and I wanted to bring an expert on executive coaching in to talk about how we can handle and address this issue in HR. I'm joined by Tegan Travato of Bright Arrow Coaching. Tegan, welcome back to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you. It's so great to be back with you, Jessica.
Let's just kind of get started. We're talking about the benefits of executive coaching, and poor leadership can be expensive for any company. It's kind of a no-brainer. We all know that. So why do so many companies fail to offer development for their managers and executives?
It's such a good question, and it's one we often hear in the coaching community. And of course, HR leaders suffer with this question a lot. I think, in short, there's a disconnection between how companies think and how they act when it comes to talent development. And I always say that resistance is caused by either fear, impatience, or ego. So at the organizational level, we can see that the fear aspect of this may be that companies aren't sure how to vet proper development for their leaders. They're not sure when it comes to coaching what kind of ROI they can expect. They may even come from a place of ego where they're just trying to rely heavily on internal training opportunities for which they feel like they've already invested, even if they don't pass muster, right? And then a lot of times on the ego side too, we view the leader's actual work or stretch assignments as the development, right? So instead of thinking we need to do more, we think, well, let's rotate this executive into this function for a while. Let them grow and stretch there. That's their development. When really the development at that level happens in the support function that we give the leader while they're going through that stretch assignment. So I think those are some of the reasons.
What's the advantage of bringing in an outside coach like you to work with company leadership?
Having a new set of eyes, a fresh set of eyes that isn't emotionally entangled with the business outcomes, isn't biased, doesn't have any political agenda. It's refreshing for any organization to have that. And part of that, we need to recognize it's important to select the right person for that kind of work. Bringing in an outside coach also helps executive teams. I work with a lot of teams, so I've watched executive teams in particular move from a group operating model into operating truly as a team. So a great outside coach, because they're not attached to this executive team in an emotional way, they can be objective, they can influence, advise, model behavior for them, and even be really overt about the fact that an executive team is operating as a group of independent leaders reporting into a CEO. Where CEOs now are finding they get much more value if the executive group begins operating as a team and having many more shared agendas, sort of letting some of the boundaries fall away and allowing sales to influence operations and operations to influence marketing, for example, just by sharing their expertise more. I've seen a lot of really astounding, fast, and big change come from that place in the executive world. The other piece is the biggest value, I think, is holding leaders accountable to action. I mean, leaders are constantly holding everyone else accountable, and they're pretty drained a lot of times because of that. And they need a nice, safe place to have some confidentiality, have a sounding board, have a firm but fair partner to help them move themselves to action. And a lot of companies, too, will use a coach to facilitate major transformation, whether it's at the individual level, the enterprise level. There are times when we have to address derailing behaviors. And we do know for sure it's from a 2009 study, so I'm curious to see how much this has increased, but outside coaches help to enhance team interactions by 48%.
Wow. Just
imagine the substantial residual impact of in improving the leadership team's operations by 48%. So those are some of the pieces I love to share with companies as they're evaluating coaching.
Well, I'm glad that companies are considering and thinking more about coaching, and particularly ways to develop and retain their workers. I read a study recently from Predictive Index, and they talked to CEOs, and CEOs said that talent was the most important thing that they're thinking about right now. 37% of them identified that as number one. And so I wanted to talk to you about maybe, so somebody's thinking about development, retention, what do they have to consider when they're looking at putting together maybe work-specific coaching and leadership training to help with that talent retention piece?
Yeah, what a great question. First of all, when I work with leaders privately who are sponsoring their own leadership development, they are often coming to me because they want more growth and the company won't pay for it, or they're considering some kind of career transition. And I can tell you for sure that any executive I've worked with that's in career transition, proactively making the change themselves, if you put two executive opportunities in front of them, apples to apples, they're both ripe with challenge, they both pay roughly the same thing, same size team, same scope of work. If one of those organizations offered executive coaching to help them through their first 90 to 120 days, or it offered formal leadership development as part of their standard issue for new leaders, they would hands down take that role. They might even take that role for less pay, less scope, because there's so little of that being offered proactively. So I think I'm just emphasizing, if you aren't considering leadership development, it is time. It will make you a big differentiator in the market. When you are considering workplace-specific coaching, I think the first thing to consider, and whether it's coaching or leadership training, there are two different models, which we'll touch on a little bit. But the first is, do you want to develop individual leaders first, or do you want to take the team approach? And if you want to do both at the same time, get clear on, or if you don't want to do both on the same time, get clear on which comes first. So if you've got a lot of infighting or leaders who aren't getting along, or you have a couple of laggards in the group that are holding the team back, individual coaching may be appropriate first. If you have an executive team or leadership team that's operating relatively well but needs to learn to do more together, you might decide to do the team coaching approach or the leadership group training approach. So I think that's number one, is get clear on your scope and what's your need. The second piece is, I talk with companies who are considering coaching, and I'll often say, well, what's your budget for this? And the two things tend to happen. One, we're not sure. Or two, here's our budget. It's a nebulous number. We have no idea how much this is actually going to cost us. So my advice would be, do some research first before you set your budget. So once you've decided, are we going with training or are we going with coaching or a hybrid of the two, talk to a few coaching organizations, get some ballpark pricing, and then put together your formal plan and budget to get approved internally. A few other areas to consider are, as you're selecting partners to do the coaching or the training, think about credentials, their specialty, evaluate how confident they are when they talk about coaching or development outcomes and ROI, and also get clear on what commitments are expected of you as a partner. Leadership development does not happen just from the coach or the trainer. It happens from each other and peer sharing. It happens by having a really engaged HR partner, a super engaged CEO and executive team. And people really need to be bought into the process and active. We cannot force coaching and development on people. They have to really show up and be ready to receive it and engage in it. And I think those are some of the things that latter piece is something organizations often overlook, is how ready are we to commit time, energy, and a commitment to change before we dive in.
One thing that you said that I think people haven't really thought about is that coaching can be a retention or an incentive tool to close the deal when you're looking for that top talent.
Absolutely.
Instead of the ping pong tables and the, additional things that I think every dry cleaning that people kind of look at as all these great things, but development, personal development is such an important part of your career growth.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you, as a coach who has done some of this coaching for new leaders, doing 90 or 120-day support roles instead of a traditional 6-month engagement, it might be a shorter engagement to help this new leader onboard. Just imagine that new leader has in their back pocket someone they meet with 2 to 3 times a month, who's talking through stakeholder mapping, who's helping them think through their onboarding plan and being really strategic about where they spend their time, how soon they implement change or don't, how to get ready for their first board meeting. I mean, it really helps them to catapult and shine. Where oftentimes, and I've been there myself, Jessica, I know you've been there probably too, we get dumped into the deep sea and the role's probably been open for months before we get there, and we get swallowed up really fast. And when you have an accountability partner that's there with you to say, you have to stay focused on your strategy, you have to stay focused on your discovery for the first 90 to 120 days, it's quite literally a secret weapon for success for a new executive.
I really wish that I would have had a coach when I went back in to the executive role. I think it really would have helped me in a lot of ways because it had been a while since I'd been in the game, right? From an entrepreneur. So I say invest in it for yourself, or more importantly, as HR leaders, maybe this is something that you can squeeze into the budget and invest in to help make those leaders really have an impact.
And you're so right. I mean, someone will sign on the dotted line for that if that's part of their package for you to sweeten the deal. Absolutely. So.
Yeah, no, it would have been fantastic. And I think folks should think about it. What are some thoughts on how HR can play a role in better leadership and positively impacting employee engagement in this area?
Yeah. Oh, such a good question. It's interesting. I've had a real influx of working with HR executives the last couple of years. And I'm so happy because that's my space, right? I spent a lot of time there. And something that is clear to me is that as HR leaders, we are eating last all the time. We are so seldom demanding investment in ourselves. And part of that is because we see how hard it is sometimes for organizations to squeeze out the money for leadership development coaching. And I don't know why we keep holding ourselves out there last, but we do. So I say, number one, HR leaders, invest in yourselves more often. If you're thinking about bringing leadership development and coaching to the organization, you will become better at vetting those opportunities and partners if you've had the experience yourself. You will understand how that experience impacts employee engagement if it has impacted you yourself. So I emphasize, number one, serve yourself first for a change. The second piece is to model what you want to see in the business. This is something I've become a real fan of as a coach, because as an executive coach, I'm constantly modeling communication techniques, behaviors, how to approach difficult conversations. HR leaders are ripe. They're in perfect positions for that on a regular basis. So what are you doing with your team? Are you living what you're asking the business to do? Oftentimes we're not, because we feel so stretched, which is no different from how the rest of the business is feeling about their teams.
The cobbler's children has no shoes, right?
Ever. Yes. And arguably we need them first. I was just talking with another HR leader about the fact that the business is about to double in size. And I said, so how ready is your team? Because if your team's not ready, the business will not scale. HR has to come first sometimes. And then finally, Jessica, I think that becoming better at speaking the language of the business when it comes to employee engagement is imperative. And I want to just maybe exemplify what I mean by that by telling you a little bit about a client I worked with last year who they were really focused on employee engagement. And I was working with their entire executive team, and they had commissioned this committee to start focusing on employee engagement for the first time ever, doing things as well as they could in terms of surveys, best practices for those surveys, how to use the results, et cetera. And earlier in the coaching with them around this topic, it was really clear to me that we were talking about the engagement side and leading with that, and secondarily talking about how the business would benefit. If we could flip that equation to say, here are the gaps in the business. We know that EBITDA is down. We know that revenue isn't where it needs to be. We saw changes in our business that we believe led to that over the last year or two or quarter or two. Here is how employee engagement can lend itself to bridging those gaps. Often as HR leaders, because we already know the end result, we already know the story, right? We are well educated. And instead of arriving to where the business is in the explanation, we need to start with where the business is and then explain what employee engagement is and how it bridges that gap.
It's a process.
It is.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. Today, we're talking about the benefits of executive coaching with Tegan Travado.
This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company, the fastest growing talent management system on the market, and recently won G2 Crowd's #1 user recommended Winter 2018 award. Visit clearcompany.com to learn more.
We tend to think about executive coaching as a one-on-one activity, but some of the things that you have talked about don't sound one-on-one. Can you talk about maybe why team coaching is so in demand right now?
Yeah, I mean, one-on-one coaching absolutely still has its place. I still do a ton of it and I love it. However, as someone who's been doing team coaching for the past couple of years, what is clear to me is at the organizational level, team coaching creates impacts that are obvious, fast, and undeniably impact the bottom line. And we absolutely see that at the individual level, but it's so private. What we talk about in those sessions is not shared outside of those sessions, and nor should it be. So we see a slow change over several months. I have watched teams come out of 2-hour coaching sessions and literally change the business from that moment forward. And that's the power of having leaders all together, right? There's just more power in that collective. That's why we have teams. I also think, as organizations get flatter, which they have been and they will continue to be, and we know we're headed for a recession, we have to be better at getting more done through our teams. So learning how to play nicer in the sandbox, learning how to communicate better, how to appreciate our differences, and learning how to take a coaching approach to our interactions within our teams will help carry things over the finish line faster. It also happens to be just a little bit cheaper. It's not a ton less expensive, but it's per head. It ends up being a little bit less expensive than if you were putting each leader through their own private coaching agenda over several months. So I think that's another reason organizations are starting to look to that. And I expect to see a rise in that as we hit a recession. And it's different. Team coaching is different from group training in that in group training, everything's very prescribed. So I know the audience here today is HR leaders. So as HR leaders, learning and development professionals, we're talking about competencies, skills we want to develop, that at the end of a training, leaders will be able to do X and Y. It is very, very prescriptive. And that has its place. But training is also an event. It happens once. And sometimes that learning transfer doesn't happen. We see people go right back to their old ways. They're too busy to implement it. Coaching is a process. So it slows things down a little bit in terms of allowing people to internalize what's happening, holding them accountable to outcomes and changes. But it also allows for the leader to co-create their development agenda with their coach. And at the team level, when we do that, I ask leaders to bring their business problem or challenge to the table for their group coaching. And we use that business problem as a way to model new communication, to navigate political stuff together, to call out behaviors that are derailing the team, to decide on new norms, and how we will be together in the future when times are tough or when we're working on this problem. And at the end of 2 hours, they have solved the business challenge. So that is what I mean by the fast and obvious change and the ability to impact the bottom line so quickly.
And you can direct that directly back to this coaching program, potentially to a change in the business. And that's really powerful.
Yeah. And the last thing I'd say on that, Jessica, which I think to me has been the most moving and probably precious part of the team coaching model, is that when you can get a group together and as the coach, model for them how to communicate, model for them how to navigate emotionally or politically charged conversations, demonstrate for them how it is okay to call each other out in respectful ways when things are not being handled well, or when a particular leader is shutting down a meeting with their unhealthy behavior. It is okay to address things like that. Our inability to navigate that is what holds teams back. And the trust that's built between a team coach and the team is what it's sacred. It allows me to come in, for example, and share that with them and ask them to then model it for the rest of the meeting. And leaders appreciate that so much because they're so often the ones on the center stage feeling uncomfortable, being scrutinized, feeling like they have to have it all together. And when you can create that kind of honesty and vulnerability inside of the team together, it is amazing how much they bond and how quickly they change.
Now, you mentioned coaching approach in kind of our last little conversation here. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because for people who aren't familiar, it might be nice to kind of back things up.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it is a hot buzz term, and I'm not sure everyone's always clear on what that means. So in short, a coaching approach is a focus on learning. It's a focus on what's going on now and where do we want to be, rather than rehashing the past, which we tend to do in businesses. It's a focus on personal responsibility, and probably the biggest change when we take a coaching approach is that we're not just focused on ourselves anymore. We really are trying to focus on the other person's agenda and being responsible for our responses and reactions to those agendas. So it's a very supportive approach. It's challenging in a healthy way. Gone are the days of executives warring on each other for power in their team meetings. It's so outmoded. We are in a time where authenticity is highly valued. Generations that have come into the workplace value finding answers on their own because they know they're smart. They know that they're capable. They just need runway to bring us the innovation and their ideas. And organizations have figured that out. A lot of organizations know that if we can give leaders and employees enough space and take a coaching approach with some curiosity, great things come from that, rather than forcing down a philosophy or forcing an idea into the business from the top down all the time. So the coaching approach, that's why it's become pretty hot in the world.
What should companies focus on when hiring an executive coach? So they're going out there, they're like, okay, I'm kind of in the market. And how should coaching be presented and managed in terms of expectations for individuals and the organization or team?
I think we're going to, if we haven't, we can include an article I wrote and a podcast I recorded on things you should consider when you're looking to hire an executive coach. And some of those I think I might have mentioned earlier, but just briefly, look for credentials. They should absolutely be an ICF. They should have graduated from an ICF certified school. What are their specialties? So do they work with particular types of challenges? Do they work in particular industries? Can they talk credibly about outcomes and ROI from coaching? To be clear, coaches, if they're worth their weight in salt, will not come into your business and promise you outcomes and specific ROI. But they should, because the client creates the agenda. There are some general things we can commit to, like increased engagement, increased retention. There are documented studies on how coaching improves organizations generally. But the coach's job is to help you get clear on what's most impactful for the business, and then you co-create that change together. Naturally, if your client is not fully engaged, we can't promise that change will happen. So I just want to caution you that if you have a coach that says, yes, by the time we're done, I promise you your company will be X and Y, it will have X and Y, you should run for the hills. They cannot control that. And what I would encourage from a process perspective, Jessica, is that especially if the HR leader, I think it's great when an HR leader owns coaching relationships because they can develop a sound process for vetting. And I'm happy to help anyone that's trying to set that up. But a process for vetting coaches, for having a bench of coaches that they know and trust at their disposal so that they can just pick up the phone and deploy them when they're needed. If you have a particular leader that needs coaching or a team, I would say the process is for you to vet a few coaches and then allow the individual leader to meet with your top two and choose the coach they want to work with. If you're selecting one for the team, you may be the one that selects the right coach for a team. And then be involved as a sponsor. That's what we would call that partner in the relationship, is the coaching sponsor, which means you've signed off on the agreement, you've vetted the deliverables. Most coaching engagements are 6 months, and there's a certain number of sessions that you get. There's goal setting processes throughout. And you want to be a part of that, making sure that it's getting done, but also understanding there are confidential boundaries, that you won't always know exactly what's happening in the coaching relationship. But you should absolutely be part of some kind of debrief, beginning, middle, and end, that tells you, yes, the client is participating. Yes, they truly are coachable as we suspected, and they're on target to hit their coaching plan. And that's really all that can be provided without violating confidentiality. Yeah, and you can ask for themes. You can ask for themes and what's being challenged in the coaching and what the outcomes should look like. But beyond that, it's pretty confidential.
Great. Thank you for that. And we'll link to your podcast interview in the transcript. So just go to Workology and scroll down and you'll be able to see the podcast interview that Tegan mentioned earlier.
Great.
So thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Before we close things out, talk to us about maybe 3 coaching skills that you feel like anyone can apply right away.
This is my favorite. I actually teach executive teams how to use these kinds of behaviors, whether it's through the coaching or sometimes just through workshops that focus on this. And there's 3 things I always tell people to look for and try to practice. 1, asking open-ended questions. And this is harder for leaders than you would ever imagine, especially at the C level, because C-suite leaders can see the answers for their people so often. But the empowerment comes from allowing people to arrive at their own answers. So if you're going to ask open-ended questions, be truly curious about what the answer is going to be instead of just waiting to respond. Also, be careful that you're not asking open-ended questions that are leading. Like, what would happen if you just took my idea, which is X? An open-ended question would be more like, what would happen if you thought outside of that box? And just be curious about what your employer or leader might say. The second coaching skill is the process or practice of acknowledging and validating. This is one of the most empowering coaching skills anyone can use within a team or private conversation. It is simply saying, I acknowledge what you're saying. I acknowledge that you're upset, or I acknowledge that you're passionate about this. And the validation piece is, and it makes sense that you feel that way because. That doesn't mean that you're saying you're right. It's just acknowledging and validating your partner's humanness in the conversation. And that sort of makes the walls fall down right away, and it leads to really powerful conversations. And I had a team I was working with a couple months ago where before they were allowed to add their point, they had to acknowledge and validate the point that was made before theirs. It was sort of a laborious process, but they hardwired the skill that way. And then the third is ask for permission to share insights. Another thing we have as a gift as leaders, and especially HR leaders, is just being able to see what's really happening in situations that are not ours. So especially as HR people, we counsel constantly, and people bring us their problems in the business. And we often want to say, well, you should, or why don't you? And instead of going that route, I always say, ask permission to share. It's as simple as, can I tell you what I see here? Or would you mind if I shared my thoughts on this? And that way you do have carte blanche to share exactly what you see. And it continues to create more of a dialogue rather than you just ending the conversation with a "you should." So those are my top 3 favorites for sure.
And you use these all the time, because even like we had cocktails a few weeks ago in Chicago and we were just talking as friends, and these are things that you do yourself, which I love.
Yeah, I live these. Absolutely. I mean, to be clear, like in that conversation, I wasn't coaching you, right?
No,
You're
just
saying
friends.
this was part of the conversation. Yeah. And trust me, I have to be careful with my husband that I'm not showing up as a coach in our conversations. But this is the coaching approach in action, which we've been talking about. It's not trying to help people. It's not solving people's problems. It's using curious questions to understand them more. And it is amazing how it leads to much more interesting conversations.
That it does. Well, Tegan, thank you so much for taking the time to come back again and talk with us. And I wanted to ask you, where can people go to learn more about you and the work that you're doing with Bright Arrow?
Oh, thank you. They can go to my website, which is brightarrowcoaching.com. I would also love to connect with you on LinkedIn. And it's probably easiest to keep up with what's going on with me just by signing up for the newsletter on my site, where we always share roughly every 2 or 3 weeks. We'll send out an update on something leadership oriented for people to think about, or a release of a new podcast episode, which is called the Life and Leadership Podcast. And I'm happy to hear from anybody with questions or thoughts on what we talked about today, too. So thanks, Jess.
Yeah, thank you. Tegan is a former recruiting executive who founded Bright Arrow Coaching to focus on a holistic approach to executive and leadership coaching. Tegan and the coaches at Bright Arrow are doing a lot of great executive coaching, working with teams and individuals. And we appreciate her tips on what we need to think about when creating a leadership development program. I was taking notes the entire time. I am going to be applying her 3 coaching skills that she suggested earlier right away. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.